was born in Annandale, Sydney, 13th of December 1920, and as a child lived in Sydney, well, as schoolboy and growing up from about, well, then came the war. I joined the New South Wales Scottish Regiment because in my mind, blind Freddie could see there was going to be another war in the not too distant future, and I was prepared to train for it. And obviously I was expected to go, and so I felt it was, you had marks on the wall if you were a trained soldier, or so had some degree of training as a soldier. It was the 30th Battalion, a unit of the militia, but it was affiliated with the Black Watch as the Royal New South Wales Scottish Regiment. The training was part of infanteering, soldiering, mastery of your weapons, small arms, light machine gun then was a Lewis gun, the rifle. They'd used it in the First War, they'd used it in the Boer War, and they used it in the Second World War. But you had to work on mastering it. And then infantry, you're on your flat feet and you've got to move under some sort of control, and you've got to move reasonably spaced so you don't present mass targets to the enemy. And all these things take training. They did it well. They did it well. I was up at a friend's place at Blackheath on the Blue Mountains. We heard on the radio that war was declared on September the 3rd. And I thought, hell, here we go. You had to be 20 years of age to get into the A.I.F. And so I had to handle myself carefully, because I had a mother that was violently anti me enlisting once this war. And I said, would you expect me to be a dingo? Because she was going to take birth certificates in and do all sorts of things. And I said, you do that, you'll only do it once, because I said, I will go interstate and enlist, and you won't know whether I'm alive or dead or whatever, for whatever period the war lasts. Now you can take your pick. If you let me go as I want to, you'll know where I am and you'll know the worst or the best, whatever the case. But so you, whichever way it goes, I'm going to enlist. Oh, she was frightened I'd get hurt. Very possessive love, I would think. Very possessive love. And once I was there, of course, everyone else that wasn't, they were dreadful people. Very tolerant, my mum. Very tolerant. I'll never forget when the enlisting person was a sergeant, an I suppose a Sergeant Clark, but he was ex-1418. And he said, what's your present job? And I said, I'm a bank officer. He said, oh, I'll put you in the finance. I said, no, you won't. I said, I'm not going. I said, you can die. I said, I'll go somewhere else and enlist as a labourer because I'm going into infantry. He said, I served with infantry in the 1418 war. He said, you insist? But he said, God go with you, son. God go with you. I was trained to do it, and I felt I had an obligation. And it would have, if I hadn't done that, it would have made a mockery of everything that I'd been going through for the last 2.5 years. I think everyone has got the thought of, I wonder if I'll see it again. You think of your dear ones. I was holding hands with Mari, my first wife. We weren't engaged or anything, but as far as I was concerned, we were going to marry. And And that was a bit with her, but there was no doubt in my mind, which turned out to be the case. I'd say 90-odd%, 98% of the troops on board had never been out of the country. Different story with the young people this day and age. But in those days, it just didn't happen. You didn't know where you were going, but you knew you were going, and you didn't know when you were going, but you knew it was in the immediate future, 1 week, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And that's how you knew you were going. They made no secret of it, but they didn't tell you where you were going to. And we didn't know until we were in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We thought the whole damn convoy would go to the Middle East. But then there was this rumour that we were going elsewhere. And we didn't have a clue where. And I suppose we were happy to go to the Middle East because that's where the action was and where the war was at that point in time. And then, oh well, we're going to Singapore. It's interesting. We'd never heard, you know, some of us had never heard of Singapore or the Malay Peninsula, or we'd seen it in geography on a map, but none of us had ever been there before. And so it was interesting. We started at Seremban and we'd rotate with the battalion with the other battalions over a few months. Month there, then a month down there and a month back and so on. And working terribly hard all the time, learning jungle tactics and what have you. And there wasn't any jungle training in Australia. You trained for the desert, wide open spaces. Our CO, Colonel Anderson, fought in the West African Rifles in the 14-18 war as a kid. He'd have been about 21 or so, had a military cross, would have been 21 or 22 when it finished. And they had close country fighting. Now, he introduced that to 8th Division with Bennett's blessing, and ran a couple of central schools, but spent the message around the infantry battalions, this is the way you do it. And we did it pretty well. You can only get good soldiers by training. Best material in the world, boom, if they're not trained. And training is a hard slog, starting from the drill square, starting to open sections in country or sections along a track with fleeting from tree to tree, etc. I mean, there's no shortcuts to training. It's hard, arduous and repetitive. Having mastered your weapons, then you've got to go into the skills of moving, whether it be in open desert or whether it be in close country. And we trained for months and there still wasn't any war. We trained for months again. Eventually there was a war, and it was a fierce one. The Muar River battle that we were in, it was a bloody affair, but it was only about 240 of us walked out of 900 blokes. We knew that the 45th Indian Brigade were young, untrained sepoys. These kids were about 3 months old in the army, 18. Now an Indian boy straight out of the hills after 3 months. Remember I said training, you got to have it to fight? Well, it applies to Indians too. And these poor devils, they were cut to pieces. And every one of their, and that's why Bennett pulled the 2nd 29th Battalion, a Victorian regiment, from 27th Brigade from the centre round Gemmis and Sagarmat. They were sort of the towns that they were holding in the centre, and pulled the 19th from Gemilawong on the east coast. We followed the 2nd 29th in, and so presented 2 Australian battalions instead of these untrained lads of the 45th Indian Brigade, they were decimated, and all their officers were killed because, again, who would the Nipponese shoot if they see a white face amongst native troops? The white face. So would we. I mean, QED. The 2 Australian battalions were holding the main approaches to Singapore on those, and it was a bloody battle indeed, that West Coast deal, I tell you. Yeah, well, we were pulled out from Gemilawong, and that's where the Muar River battle started. We went down into an area called Bakri Crossroads, and the 2nd 29th Battalion were further down the road, and this is where we tangled with the 5th, they were late Japanese troops, the Imperial 5th Division Imperial Japanese Guards. We'd heard a lot of crap, that they were short-sighted, couldn't see terribly well, and little fellas, none of them were. They weren't in the Imperial Guards Division, they were up around the 6-footers. 5'10", 6 feet was quite common, because they were the pick of the crop. They were also experienced soldiers. They'd campaigned in China for Yonks against Chinese, often untrained Chinese, and the game was on their side. I think this Muar River deal was the first time they were ever really tested, and they had horrendous losses, horrendous losses. It taught me that the Guards Division were damn fine troops, to the point of being silly at times, because they'd come on the face of machine gun fire and being led by their idiot officers with 2-handed swords, who got themselves killed, and many of the people, banzai charges and that sort of thing. And you can't walk through thick machine gun fire. Some might get through it, but they'll be shot individually by riflemen. But it's bad business. But they weren't used to this sort of resistance. They weren't used to it in China. By the time they turned a banzai charge on, the other people had had a gutful anyhow and would dissolve. But these people didn't, the Australian people didn't. And they paid an enormous price for it, Nipponese general said the Imperial Guards were never the same troops again. They lost their officers almost 100% or 99.9%. Well, who are you going to shoot first if you see a character out with a 2-handed sword exhorting the troops? On you come, bang, over he goes, and then devote yourself to the rest. I was involved fairly early in the peace. I had a section of carriers forward with our C Company who were holding Bakri village. We had A Company on the right, Don on the left, and I think A was in reserve, or no, B in reserve. No, B down that road, and Don must have been in reserve. But it was C Company that we had. 2nd 29th were about 3/4 of a mile or a mile down the road from Bakri. We were in Bakri village and stayed there. We had it pretty, we were attacked on various fronts, but we coped with it fairly well. But we took the section down, and I brought the acting CO, a fella called White, I think it was, a Major White. Robertson had been there, CO had been killed. We also brought back some journalists. He'd been filming the tank attack. They'd knocked off 8 or 10 tanks in the raid and attacked their side. And they had a bloody old deal there, which was the first introduction to the Nipponese, that what different troops they were attacking. They laid on their guts and shot them. Easy as that. They didn't turn on them, they didn't break them. And the casualties the Nips sustained were left out for dead. I saw this bloody 2-pounder gun. Our tracks made the noise on the road. This thing swung round our way. And I can remember standing, I had my shirt off, and but I was pretty brown. But I had a slouch hat, waving this over the front. And then I saw another slouch hat wave back, and I thought, thank God for that. These blokes didn't miss, you know. They were the fellows that had shot the 8 tanks up in the, well, one end and one the other. They'd shot up a 1,500 weight utility and heaped some logs on it. And Anderson said to me, Jim, can you get your carrier down and pull that bloody thing off the road? I said, we'll do that, sir. So we backed the carrier down. A boy called Mark Lever, as a sergeant. I said, you up on the front of it, Mark, and see if you can steer it. And I got a tow rope out, and I'm on my back, putting the cable round the rear axle to pull this thing out. And a bloke opens up from a tree, and when I stood up, my webbing fell off. He'd shot it off, and I didn't have blood to show for it. Around my legs. When he opened up, all hell broke loose for him from C Company, from the other 2 carriers with a Vickers gun and a Lewis gun each, and I heard him fall out of the tree. He was dead finish. But my God, I was so lucky. You know, that was in the opening gambit. The next day, we were still there. I got involved in a hell of a firefight with our A Company, because every section was being used. We had 12 carriers, 4 sections of 3, and the platoon headquarter carrier, which was the 13th. Now, A Company had a hell of a turnout going on. They were holding the top of a hill within 400, 500 yards of battalion headquarters. Frank Beverley wanted some support. They had them basically pinned down with heavy machine gun fire, very close to them. So I went up with this platoon headquarter carrier, and there I got my first wound, because I'd put, oh God, I don't know, 11 or 12 belts through. It's 250 rounds in a belt, and to very good effect. You could see these blokes. See, sitting in a carrier, it's a bit like sitting in this chair, and your surface is covered with seedling rubber, probably about that high. Now at this level, as opposed to being on your belly on the ground, you got quite good visibility, and I was able to give them hell with this Vickers gun, and they counted about 9 machine guns had been knocked out when we, that was all A Company were getting the effect of it. But eventually they shot one in through the slit in the front and pierced the gun, and the water poured out on the leg, because I had bare legs like this and sitting with the gun back into your belly, and it was this side that got hit and the water poured out on the right leg. And so we had to, but however, the pressure had been relieved on A Company at that point, because Frank Beverley got them and they did a bayonet charge forward at that point and cleared the rest of them right off the top of the ridge. So I went back to battalion headquarters and got this dressed, and so it continued. That was, we still had 3 days, pretty rough stuff after that. He was completely fearless. He just ignored it. Absolute rubbish, you know. And how he wasn't killed, I'll never know. I think it was, we were just breaking through on one of these roadblock things. He charged individually a medium machine gun. I think there were two of them. And he threw a grenade in, then rushed in and finished them off with a .38 pistol. And he was a bloke that could fire a pistol. Not many people could. And but he'd shot lion with a .45 Colt automatic. And he was an experienced, big game hunter as well as farmer from in Kenya. And but he was an exceptional soldier and leader, And the only thing that you could give him to really do justice to his bravery was a VC. Anderson took over the combined force, and then, having got the 2nd 29th back with us, we had about 3 or 4 days fighting through roadblocks and what have you to get to gambling on the fact that the bridge at Parit Sulong, a village across the river, on the edge of the river, was still ours. Anderson was concerned about that bridge from the time he crossed it. And it was the bridges that brought us undone. We couldn't force that bridge. They had concentrated machine guns under houses, couldn't mortar them, couldn't blast them with a 25 pounder. And that's where we had to surrender the wounded. Anderson asked me, he said, can you walk? I said, with assistance I can. Well, he said, you collect anyone that can walk and prepare to go from the wounded and take them through Yongpeng. He gave me some instructions map-wise. And this I did, and I had about 20 or 30 blokes. Only 2 fellas that were unwounded were 2 transport drivers. And I used to use them as crutches, and they'd get me up if I was down, if I was resting. To get up I needed assistance because of this leg. It was an inside and outer through the thigh, and a 3rd degree burn on the lower leg. A Vickers gun hit in the carrier and copped the water, boiling of course, down the right lower leg fairly early in the piece, because you were firefights, almost point blank range, 50 to 100 yards. We left them in good faith under the CO's orders. I'd been along these trucks and I said, we're going to try and give it a go to get on Anderson's instructions. To get to Yongpeng, anyone feels they can walk it. Do you want to be in it? Some came, and we got through, and some didn't. And probably they couldn't. They were at the end of their tether. When our fellows with rifles and bayonets at the high port came through the rubber, they thought it was an attack, and they pulled back. They'd have killed a lot more of us if they hadn't, but they'd had a gutful at that point in time. And they let us through. And these wounded that I had, we followed in the wake of the rifle companies. And then we couldn't keep with them, of course, but we got across the river where we could wade, or we might have had a couple of strokes to swim. We only had 1 non-swimmer with us, I think. Another fella and myself got him across between us. We were very fortunate in getting through the, I suppose we'd have had about 18 or 20 miles to walk through the scrub, and eventually came out of Yongpeng, which was in the centre, when those of us with wounds were picked up by ambulances and went to CCSs, etc., and on to hospitals. There was a fellow called Bob Irvin. He was a corporal in the transport platoon, and God, he was a country bloke, and he was built like a tree. You know, you'd hit him, you'd bust your hand. and extraordinarily strong. I've never seen a man quite as strong as him. And we formed quite a close friendship. And in fact, had he survived the war, and he didn't get out of Malaya, out of Muar River, we'd have had a go at the land together. I said, Bob, can you get back? And I said, if we cross further up, you can stick with this crowd that I've got and be more of us together, and it shouldn't have to swim a bit further. He said, Jim, I wouldn't make it back. He'd been hit several times, apparently. So he got to the bank, and I saw him get out of the river. And that's the last that's ever been heard of him. He was missing in action, believed dead. And I have no doubt that he was dead. He either died of his wounds or the nips would have caught up with him. And hopefully shot him quickly. I bloody realised then that if he couldn't get back with me, he'd be battling on the other side on his own. Because he was only 400 yards, I suppose, from where most of the action, and I'd say he was weakened. And he thought, well, I'll get across the other side, that's where our mob, if I can get, far enough there, I'll strike him. And it had taken a lot out of him to swim the Ruddy River. I mean, the average person wouldn't have been able to do what he did. He was such a strong fella. But I knew then that I was doubtful that I would ever see him again.
How did that feel?
Bloody dreadful. But your adrenaline flows and you've got the job to do with these 30 fellas that you got with you. And so you box on. It's also very heartrending when you see fellas that you've known for 12 or 18 months, probably played football with them, and they're dead meat, finished. And not one but a number. It's very sobering. It's very sobering. This is why I think they'd had such a drubbing. Was one reason for this dreadful massacre that happened at Parit Sulong Bridge. We'd left them with white towels to surrender, and we didn't think for 1 minute they'd be massacred at that point in time. But we changed our opinion when we heard what had happened. This fella, I'd known him when he was a sergeant in the Scottish Regiment. I knew his wife, I knew his kids. He was an older man than me, obviously, probably 30, 31, foot in the grave job. From the point of view of a 21-year-old. But going off, I said to him, Ray, I find it very difficult to leave you here. He said, Jim, you do what you've been told to do. He said, POQ. And he said, see Joyce for me if you get back to Sydney. And I said, I will, which I did. It was his wife. And but that was another, just in mind, a dreadful moment. This cove that was with me got cut off he was a corporal in the mortar platoon, and he was doing control, gun, mortar control, firing and so forth, and he got cut off. And he got out later on his own, and he saw what happened. He saw him empty them out of the trucks, and they crawled or were assisted by other fellows that could walk, and they were packed into a garage, a double garage belonging to the main roads, something or other, not main roads board, something similar though. And some residential buildings of theirs were down on this side of the village. And eventually that afternoon, a bit later, they pulled them out and shot them and threw their bodies onto a fire, burnt them. It was, cold-blooded, dreadful thing. And they were all injured. None of them were moving freely. Some of them couldn't stand or walk. when we were in hospital, and all of the 5 of us had all been wounded, but we're all breaking our necks to get back to the battalion would be going home. We said, we want to go back. And they said, no, you can't, you've got open wounds. We said, we're not going to sit on our arse and be taken. They said, well, it's your decision and it's your right. You'll be prisoners of war in the next couple of hours. And so we explained the position to them, which we had to quote back here too, because they said, why did you leave the hospital? And as we said, because we wanted to get home, couldn't go back to our unit, and we didn't want to become prisoners of war. And we escaped and looked them right in the bloody eye. Stuart and I organised it. We invited Reg, if he wanted to be in it, because we knew of his quartermaster experience with Patrick Steamship Company. He was a management trainee there pre-war. The other 2 boys were 2 extra hands. Now, I knew both of them very well, and we got on very well. And Bill, he was tickled to death to be asked because he was a corporal. I mean, but there were. I didn't go around the officers' ward canvassing. I knew Bill, if he said yes, he'd be good value, and that was it. Wright had a foot injured, and I think, oh God, what was his name? Bloke that was commissioned in the field and he got an MM. He had fresh wounds of shrapnel, in arms and back. Not any particular one, that penetrated the far enough to hurt him or hurt his internal organs. And Stuart had a 1 foot in plaster from 2 broken toes, which came off when we had to wade in on the island, and it just healed itself from then on. A piece of Jap 4-inch mortar exploded alongside me, and I was a bit low, hitting the earth, and one caught me in that thigh. I had several other pieces in various parts of my body, but they weren't serious. But that one slowed me down. And before that, had been scalded on, you can still see the mark there probably. And that was what they call them, a 3rd degree burn or something, scald from the machine gun in the carrier when they shot it out. And, but I had bits of, I'd find odd bits of shrapnel in my arms, and I've still got Pat Chan, the local, he said, oh, you've still got a bit of the Nipponese in your shoulder. There's a bit in there. I think that's where it would have come from. And the announcement came over 5 minutes before we took off, that the Nipponese had control of the gate. We were now officially prisoners of war. We had 2 Tommy guns. I took a rifle by choice. Never keen on a Tommy gun. We had a pistol apiece. We had a bottle of whiskey apiece of scotch from the sergeant's mess. We had some hardtack. We didn't quite know where we were going. We were just going bloody looking. And this Siglap Kampong place, they had some 14 to 16 foot size sampans, 3 or 4 of them, anchored off the shore. Clem Hunt took his clothes off and swam out, brought one in, poled it in. We found 3 sweeps, 1 to steer by, 2 to row by. And we got on this, and Reg Thomas said he'd steered a surf boat, Cronulla Life Saving Club. We said, right, you're the sweep man, and we divided the 2 of us each on and off with the rowing. We headed for Samba Island. We were very cooperative, but we worked the sampan, Reg Thomas steering it, and because he'd steered a surf boat with a sweep. And the other, I think it was Clem Hunt and myself, and Stuart Burt and and the other guy, Hunt, they worked together on the oars. We had one oar, pardon me, either side, and to propel the sampan. And we got there early afternoon, and we were euchred. You know, we'd been in hospital for a few weeks, and although I'd done a bit of training, the other fellas were more euchred than I was, I think, because I'd G'd myself up a bit and up and down the stairs with on the crutches. We got across the island, which was only absolutely chock-a-block with storage tanks, all of them burning. There'd be 400 to 500 yards around that island with a black mass of smoke that completely obscured it. You could see it at ground level, but you couldn't see it from the air. We had complete cover from air for probably half a mile round it. And we get to the other side, and here are two Malays in with a half cabin launch with shell markings on it. It was obvious who it belonged to, and they'd pinched it, and they were also pinching 4-gallon tins of petrol, tea to a wooden case. Have you ever seen those in the bush? So we indicated to them we were going to join them. They weren't real happy about that, but there was not a thing in the world they could do about it. And so we continued south. It would be about dusk. We struck a Dutch patrol officer in a thing like a PT boat, and he had it loaded up with women and kids, and he said, there's a boat here that normally trades, and he said, I'll instruct the Chinese crew that you people are taking over it. And he said, there's about 35 fellas. He said, there's a mixture of Australians, there's a couple of volunteers, militia blokes who were English volunteers in the Federated Malaya forces, 4 Argyle and Sutherland Highlanders, cross-section of people, about 25 or 30. He said, you take this with you, with your party, and he said, run this and I'll instruct the captain to take you to Tanjong Penang. We reported to the harbour master there, and we all had our wounds dressed. In fact, they sent nurses down to the boat and said, anyone, you know, they brought gear with them. And he gave us 2 charts. He said that at last night tonight we're leaving in a convoy. He said, you fellas can be the second last. And he gave us these 2 charts, and he said, look, your first leg on this one finishes about there. And we said, right, and we checked the compass bearing. And we started off, and she's all serene, paddled along nicely for hours. And then what they call in those waters a Sumatra, which is a sudden storm, downpour of water, of rain and wind. And this fella, I only know him as Slim, and he slipped. Over tea, he went into the sea, screaming, for Christ's sake, help me, for Christ's sake, help me, I can't swim. And Stuart Burt had a torch, you know, these things about this long that throws a beam for about 50 yards, 60 yards. And he picked him up in the water, and you could see him kicking and swimming like Boy Charlton, you know, those days. But with these great boots on. So Reg Thomas, who did the steering on this, he had a quartermaster's certificate from Patrick Steamship Company on the coastal boats. And he was a trainee management team, I think, Reg, civilian job. And he had this quartermaster's certificate, so that's why he was steering this. And once we switched the torch on, the last one in the convoy went round us and got on with his business. And we said, well, where are we? Because we're then on our own, with the rain pelting down like hell and a bit of a blow. And we'd reckoned, we'd been following the first, on the chart, the first leg he'd plotted. And we'd reckoned that at 4.5 knots or something, and the X hours we'd been going, we'd be at the end of that. So we dropped the hook, waited for daylight for about 2 hours, maybe more, had a bit of a sleep. And as soon as the light came up, we pushed off on the second bearing. We finished up within 2 miles of the marker at the mouth of the Indragiri River, which was miles wide, at that point where it came out. Over the time we were inspected from water. We had the crew, the Indian crew on deck. Every one of our people we put below and said, do not show your face. We had a Chinese flag on and we had 5 inspections from NIP aircraft, and they let us go because they thought we were a local trading boat, and they didn't see a white face. We were the only boat that left Tanjong Penning that got across, because they'd all been sunk by planes. And but for the fact that they couldn't see a white face on ours, they would have sunk us too. So, you know, how lucky can you be? Fate was kind to us. You couldn't say anything else. You know, the fact that this fella fell overboard and picking him up, we got out of the convoy and we dropped the hook and waited for daylight, which was a couple of hours down the track. I can't remember exactly. At least 2 hours, might have been 3. And the fact that we were on our own got us across that strait to Sumatra. Otherwise we'd have been sunk. QED, as simple as that. The HMS Dani, which was a 6-inch gun cruiser, my favourite ship in the bloody British Navy. I think there's still a Dani somewhere. They carry the name on. It goes back for ages. Anyhow, they put it up full of ships that had been sunk in the harbour. Came in like a Manly ferry. Very dapper 2-striper with a beard came down and said, could I have the senior officer present, please? And that's the British brigadier. He said, sir, will you have your troops? He said, troops first, officers last, in file up the gangplank. And they embarked 600 people, odd, in an hour. And they shot off. And just as they made seaway at the mouth of the harbour, the Nips came over. It was the biggest, we were in ditches and drains round the wharf. They were doing it over regularly. And we had several attacks, but no one was concerned about it because these people had the teeth to hit back. And they landed us at Cilacap in Java. And 2 days I think it took us to get down there on the cruiser. We've had a road map, no problems, it was follow your nose. We got in the suburbs of Jakarta and there's a Dutchman stopped us and said, where are you fellas going? We said, the Hotel de Zans. He said, well, you're in real trouble if you do. He said, the Nips have got it. We said, what happened to Wavell? He said, he flew out to India 2 days ago. So we said, do you want a ride? He said, yes, thank you very much. He didn't even ask us where we were going. So he got in the back of the car and we went back to Purwokerto, told the story that Jakarta was in the hands of the NIP. And at this particular stage, I understand that Cilacap was the only port left in Java still controlled by the Dutch. And the old Stewart and I fronted the Colonel and said, look, if this business is like this tomorrow, we'd spotted 2 Dutch tugs up the end. I said, how about we have a fly to get out under our own stream on one of those tugs? He said if it's like this in the morning, he'd agree. So anyhow, the morning came and we were told to, a lot of Yanks came in that night too. And they'd come from across the other side of Java. They'd been flying B-17, flying fortresses, and they'd done a marvellous job. They'd sunk about 80 Jap ships in the Makassar Straits and down around that side. But they'd lost all their aeroplanes on the ground. So they came over to evacuate to Australia. And they went on this vessel, the Abikirk, with us. And they'd brought .50 machine guns out of their aircraft with us that they used as anti-aircraft weapons on the deck. And the great comfort they were. Anyhow, the following day, late-ish in the afternoon, 15 vessels left out of there. And as I said, we were on the Abikirk. Most of the Brit fellas that had been with us was on a thing called the Kotagedi, and both it and the Abikirk were told to run independently, not stay with the convoy, because they could cruise at about 20 knots, which was a bit fast for subs and things. We made for Fremantle, the Kotagedi made for Colombo. It got there and we got to Fremantle, and the other 13 ships were all sunk on the first night out by surface craft. So, you know, how lucky again can you be? We sailed all night, so we're starting to put the miles between the Javanese coast and ourselves. And about midday, 11 o'clock, something like that, we were picked up by a recce aeroplane. They obviously got on their blower back to Java and gave our position. Because about an hour and a half, 2 hours after that, 3 aeroplanes came on the horizon. They each had 2 bombs, about a 250-pound capacity. Some of it might have been 500, I don't know. They had 2 each, and they had a crack, but they didn't hit us. And then they came in line astern, and they were going to strafe the vessel. Well, if you could have seen the stuff that went out from that vessel with these .50 machine guns, twin Lewis guns, twin Vickers guns, 303 Brownings, you know, the Jap, or Garans, the American rifles. We had a few 303s between us. We all added to the throng, but you could see the lines of fire going into the first one, and I don't know how he survived it. But however he did, but the other 2 didn't come in for it. They gave it away and they went off. Well, we reckoned that we were probably at this point in time, if they radioed back, that they'd be flat out to get other aircraft out to us before dark. Once we made dark, we were set. Poor old Reggie Thomas, nerves got to him a bit on the ship coming home. He disappeared, and he'd gone down the hold. You didn't look and you didn't hear, and he just didn't come on deck at all. And which was fair enough. He'd made his contribution, and it was out of his hands. And God knows, it was fair enough that he had a little bit of a setback at that point in time. The 5 of us that got out of hospital together were put in a DC-3 and flown via Adelaide, Melbourne, coming down at like Kalgoorlie and places on the business, because they did about a 300 or 400 leg, and they'd gas them up again and on they'd go, real milk run. So we got to Melbourne early in the evening, and old Stewart and I, they said, well, will you come to our accommodation, and do you want to go to your own? We said we'd go to our own, and he was a fairly well-to-do grazier, Stewart, in civilian life. He knew the Windsor very well, and they knew him. So we had 2 single rooms at the Windsor and lived in style for one night. And thoroughly enjoyed it. Then we flew to Sydney the next day and went home on leave, and that's the escape story. We were extraordinarily fortunate, extraordinarily fortunate. We knew that Singapore had surrendered. We heard that on the river, and you know we were horrified, absolutely horrified. I think most of the Australians were. But however, that was we'd rolled the dice and we'd made our choice, so we all for going on. There was no returning on that, because if the Nips caught you, you were gone. They'd execute you for having escaped from Singapore. They didn't muck about with that Geneva Convention bit that it was legal to escape as a prisoner of war if it was possible. Thinking the conditions that your mates were enduring. I mean, not that we knew that much about them, but they had to, knowing what these people would do to massacring wounded people, for example. They wouldn't have... and their fatalistic attitude to soldiering, that they would commit hara-kiri, give their lives, you know, commit suicide in the flick of an eye. Completely different attitude to yours and mine. Completely different attitude. It was with some trepidation that I went back to the 1st, 2nd 19th Battalion Anzac March in 47, I think it was. Yes, I was in the bush in 46. I didn't know how the boys had received me. I hadn't been a prisoner. And they'd had 3 years, 10 months. Now, as it turned out, they received me with open arms. So I was in the fold. I had, but you could understand a person would have these mental worries and reservations. I felt regretful, and particularly that chap I mentioned, Ray Snelling, whom I knew his wife and I knew his kids. I'd known him for several years. He was in C Company in the Scottish Regiment. And I'd been on guards with him. You know, he was a sergeant, I was a corporal, and you know, that sort of jazz. And it's, you know, you're fairly close to them, particularly when you know families. And I had to see Joyce when I came home, which wasn't an easy task. People in Australia didn't know what a war was all about. You can't if you haven't been to one. You can't. But there's a lot of people in Australia, from when you look at the figures and the statistics of World War I and World War II and subsequent combatant circumstances in which we found ourselves, there's quite a lot of people and their loved ones who have got sympathy with the service life. And but people don't know, my dear, about war unless you've been there. We could waste in the, I suppose, the futility of it. But however, it's got to be done. What did you do to avoid it when you've got people like Mussolini and Hitler and the Nips? It's difficult, those, but it's not a real answer or desirable answer for any circumstance. But it's probably got to be used in the desperation, forced to use it. But there's nothing glamorous or lovely about it. Not one thing in the world. You don't realise how your appearance changed. I can remember when I got back from Malaya, I bumped a fellow called Clem Caneen. He'd be a couple of years older than me, and he didn't go to the war for some reason or other. He had a number of kids. He might have been 2, 3 years older than me. And but I bumped him in King Street one day, and I said, "G'day, Clem." I'd been back a matter of some few weeks, and he said, "Hello." He didn't know me. I said, you don't know me, Clem. He said, your face is ringing bells, but he said, you got me. I said, Jim Howard. Oh, no, no. And you know, he was speechless, absolutely speechless. So I must have looked a bit older, I would think, at that point in time than when I'd gone away. Well, you matured so enormously. And I think I'd gained confidence as a soldier because I'd faced angry men. I hadn't gone to water. And I knew I never would because I was more frightened of failing than I was of being frightened. That's what it amounted to. And no bloody hero, but just that you're more frightened of failing than you are of being frightened. They tell me I've got post-traumatic stress syndrome. I get a bit depressed at times. Can you imagine the nerve strain of whether a bloody Nipponese is going to appear out of the track or behind the next tree, and you've got limited vision, you're listening, you're using all your senses, and you're looking, you're even smelling, and you move accordingly. Now, whether you like it or not, that takes a lot of strain. It puts a lot of strain on individuals, right down to the humblest private soldier. And, you know, imagine a forward scout, or 2 scouts and pounds in front of the platoon or the first moving body. And fellas loved it. There are some blokes that would become, of their own volition, would become forward scouts. I could imagine nothing worse. I'd go forward and have a damn good look because you'd have to, because to commit intelligently the other troops, you have to go forward and look. And but these blokes that were very happy as forward scouts, I had a death wish. Probably the first of it started when you got to hospital and your wounds were dressed and you were shaven, you were clean, you'd been bathed, and then you tried to sleep. And you had all sorts of dreams, and that continued on for quite some time. And even the post-war period, I'd go to sleep and Mari would try and keep away from me because if she touched me, I'd immediately awake. What's up? What's up? You know, sotto voce. And her hair would nearly stand on end because she didn't expect me to wake. But you're so much, it's an indication that you're carrying it in your mind. And they find that it comes back. A doctor told me just a few months back that whiskey and hard work had kept me straight over my working life. And I take medication for it. And really I do pretty well. I'd have been given 1,000 quid many times to have been 1,000 miles away from where I was at that particular time. But having survived them, I have no regrets.